Hi, Assalamu alaikum. Good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. And we're just about to start our weekly new live class on understanding the Prophet Muhammad. So we'll just wait a couple minutes to get some people to join us, and we'll be starting the class shortly. Thank you for joining. All right, in the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, I want to welcome you and thank you for joining our weekly Facebook Live class designed for people of all faiths, all backgrounds, all cultures, all religions to have a greater understanding of the life and the message of the Prophet Muhammad. May the peace and blessings of God be upon him and upon all of his great messengers from Adam, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, and the countless others that were sent to take humanity from darkness to light and establish compassion, peace, and love and justice amongst humanity. This topic is honestly, and I'm obviously a little bit biased here, but it's probably one of the most relevant and important topics of our time. And I pray that God blesses me with the ability to do this topic justice despite my own shortcomings. The Quran describes the Prophet Muhammad as being sent as nothing but as a mercy to all creation. He wasn't just sent as a mercy to Muslims or a mercy to mankind, as the name of our course is, but really as a mercy to everything in existence. And really, if there's one thing that our world needs today, and our country needs today, and our society needs today, it's mercy. Every day, unfortunately, we turn on the news and we see the effects of human beings not having mercy upon each other. From the violence, we hear about the racist killings, the so-called revenge attacks, just racism and abuse of authority, to pollution, oppression and violence is all really based in people not having the divine mercy which God has commanded us to have with each other. And really a person cannot be a true follower of the Prophet Muhammad if they are not a source of mercy for their family, for their community, for their country, and their world. I believe that by studying the life of the Prophet Muhammad correctly and authentically, we can foster mercy, compassion, love, and peace in our world. The reality is ultimately ignorance is our worst enemy. It's the source of greed, it's the source of hatred, it's the source of even violence. And unfortunately, ignorance leads to misunderstanding, misunderstanding leads to fear, fear leads to hate, and hate ultimately leads to discrimination and acts of violence that divide our country. You know, one of my collections of the Prophet Muhammad's teachings that I was reflecting over the other day, the Prophet Muhammad warned that close to the day of judgment, there will be a decrease in knowledge, there will be an increase in ignorance, and an increase in bloodshed. So the Prophet Muhammad connected an increase in ignorance with an increase in bloodshed. There's a connection between ignorance and violence. In fact, it is those who are ignorant of God's message of mercy and compassion and love for humanity, who would dare engage in violence against the creation of God. Because you cannot honor God if you do not honor the creation of God. You cannot honor God by showing violence and disrespect to his creation. The violence we see from terrorism to racist killings to attacks on police officers who are protecting our community are ultimately rooted in ignorance. Ignorance, often willful, of the divine message of compassion. And as I mentioned, you can't honor God without honoring the creation of God. And the Prophet Muhammad was sent really with a message of mercy to humanity, which I believe all of us can tremendously benefit by learning about. One of my favorite verses in the Quran, which we will learn about in this course, and the Quran being what we believe God revealed to Prophet Muhammad to guide humanity as the spoken word of God delivered through the angel Gabriel. The Quran warns against injustice driven by hatred. God says in the Quran, what's translated as, "Let not hatred lead you to be unjust. Let not hatred of a people lead you to be unjust." What is it that takes people away from being just to each other? What is it that takes people away from being merciful to each other? What is it that leads people to be violent or hateful to each other? It is hatred. And that's why the Quran says, do not let hatred lead you to be unjust. Hatred takes people away from justice. America is supposed to be a country that is built upon the principles of justice. Therefore, because hatred is destructive to justice, we can really say hatred is destructive to America. And we see the effects of that in the news every single day. And the reality is that ignorance fosters hatred. Ignorance fosters hatred, which often leads to injustice, which leads to the problems that we have in society. So knowledge is the key to overcoming that. People are often surprised to learn that the first verse in the Quran was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad. In fact, the first command that God revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, it was not pray, it was not worship, rather it was read, recite in the name of your Lord. And this, of course, reveals through reading the divine revelation, but generally, one of the most important points that the Prophet Muhammad emphasized was the importance of simply gaining knowledge. That knowledge, especially knowledge rooted in divine ethics, love, and compassion, is the key for solving the problems that we face as a society. And to gain knowledge is one of the greatest acts of worship in the Islamic tradition. So generally, just by getting to know about each other, we can avoid going down the path of fear and prejudice that can divide us. And I often say this in my civil rights work, as many of you know, I'm a civil rights attorney, that our enemies can never destroy us as Americans. We can only destroy ourselves if we allow fear and hate driven by ignorance to divide us and turn us against each other, and be willing to undermine the principles of liberty, diversity, and justice that make America so great. And so generally, as I mentioned, by getting to know each other, we can stop going down that dark path of ignorance, fear, division, and hatred. And more specifically, I think, by gaining more knowledge about the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings of God be upon him, we can learn from his example and find solutions to the problems plaguing our world today. We can learn how he transformed a racist, sexist, oppressive society whereby the rich and the powerful abused and devoured the poor and the weak, into an egalitarian society where people of all races, colors, languages respected each other and stood for justice regardless of socioeconomic status, race, or religion. As the Prophet Muhammad said in his final sermon, which we will study later on in this course, and again, this course will be given every single week, most likely Mondays at 6 o'clock, but I'm open to feedback, so if there are better days or times that you would like to enjoy this course, please just send us a message or put something in the comments. And by the way, take a minute right now, make sure to share. Please go ahead and share, and you can click follow and share so you can make sure that other people can benefit from this course that we're having about the Prophet Muhammad. And in fact, we're going to be studying some books together. So if you actually share this live broadcast right now, when you send us a message about why you want to learn about the life of the Prophet Muhammad, we'll actually be giving out some of the free books valued at about $80 each. So make sure to share and send us a message if you'd like a copy. Anyway, as the Prophet Muhammad said in his final sermon, which we will study later, he said this to tens of thousands of his followers shortly before his death 1,400 years ago. He said, all mankind is from Adam and Eve. An Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor a non-Arab has any superiority over an Arab. Also, a white has no superiority over a black, nor a black has any superiority over white, except by piety and good action. Learn that every Muslim is a brother to every Muslim, and that the Muslims are all one family. So this is a very powerful message here, basically breaking away the walls of racism based on ethnicity, based on language, based on skin color that have often been used to divide people and turn people against each other. The majority of the conflict and the tension and the injustice in our country, in America today, results from a failure of us to understand this very simple message that the Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings of God be upon him, taught us over 1,400 years ago. If every American, if every human being simply acted just upon this one lesson of the Prophet Muhammad, we would not see the daily killings of African Americans that happens by law enforcement, or the wrongful killings of law enforcement officers by criminals. That really, we would not see the cycle of violence, and violence that's perpetuated by racism. I mean, since this country's inception, unfortunately, you've had unarmed African Americans killed practically daily by, whether it was by gangs, by mobs, by even law enforcement. You wouldn't see these problems happening had we simply understood this message that we are all the creation of God and we are all equal before our Creator, regardless of the color of our skin or our ethnicity, or the language we speak, or where our parents were born. So hopefully by studying the life and the message of the Prophet Muhammad, again, regardless of our race or our religion, we can overcome some of the social, educational, and economic inequalities that plague us and plague our society. So this was just simply one of the countless lessons from the life of the Prophet Muhammad, which he didn't simply teach or speak about, but which he successfully implemented in a society that was facing many of the same problems and challenges that we are facing here today in America in the year 2016. In fact, he literally and practically transformed a racist society into one where racism was just socially unacceptable. And that's certainly no small task, as we can see as our country continues to struggle with issues of racism, division, and violence. The Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings of God be upon him, made clear that racism is a sign of ignorance. Racism is a sign of ignorance, and he was able to have the powerful recognize and be ashamed of their own racist positions and their racist remarks, and embrace those whom they discriminated against, while also engendering empowerment, love, and forgiveness from the victims of their abuse and the victims of their discrimination. And I think one of the great stories, and we'll see many of these stories throughout our class. And again, if you're just joining us, please go ahead and click share, invite your friends to join this important conversation about the life of the Prophet Muhammad that's designed really for all people, regardless of their race or religion or ethnicity, to benefit from. So the story of one of the Arab leaders really highlights how Prophet Muhammad really transformed those around him. The story of Abu Dhar illustrates this point very well. The Prophet Muhammad's close friend, Abu Bakr, he freed Bilal. Bilal was an African slave held by one of the polytheist leaders of the Quraysh tribe where the Prophet Muhammad lived. And we're going to study all this in future classes. But anyway, Bilal was actually one of the first people who embraced the message of Prophet Muhammad, and he was a slave, and he was horribly persecuted by his polytheist, wealthy, powerful slave master. They took Bilal out in the middle of the desert where the ground was scorching. You could literally cook eggs on the ground, and they put him on the ground. They took stones above him and tried to crush him. They whipped him, they beat him. They said, renounce your belief in one God. And that's why they opposed him. And we'll see, because the reason they opposed this message that there is only one God is because if there's one God, that means there's one humanity. And it means all human beings are equal before this one God. And it would really destroy their social order that was built on oppressing the weak and the disenfranchised, as we'll talk about in this course. So Bilal was being tortured, and Abu Bakr, one of the Prophet Muhammad's friends, heard of this and immediately went and freed him, purchased him and freed him from slavery. And the Prophet Muhammad eventually actually appointed Bilal, who was a freed African slave, to become the mu'adhin, the one who calls people to prayer. And he was actually became Prophet Muhammad's close friend, close confidant, and even his personal treasurer. And he had one of the most noble and honorable, respected positions in the Muslim society. This was a freed African slave, something that was unheard of at the time. This was something very revolutionary to have. So anyway, one day, Abu Dhar, who was a leader of one of the tribes, the Ghifari tribe in Saudi Arabia, or what we now call as Saudi Arabia, Abu Dhar was one of the leaders of one of the powerful tribes there. He got in an argument with Bilal. So as he was arguing with Bilal, Abu Dhar became angry. And when people become angry, sometimes they say horrible racist things that they should never ever believe, much less say. So Abu Dhar responded to Bilal by saying, hey, you can't comprehend this, O son of a black woman. This is what he said to him, which was obviously a very racist, horrible thing to say. So then Abu Dhar says that sometime later a man came to me and said that the messenger of God, Muhammad, summoned me. So I went to him, and the Prophet Muhammad was extremely upset, extremely upset. He said, I have been informed that you addressed Bilal as the son of a black woman. Now, mind you, this is in what was a racist tribal society 1400 years ago, and Abu Dhar is the leader of one of the tribes here. And he insulted a freed slave, which at that time would have not had much value in society, except for his position with the Prophet Muhammad and Prophet Muhammad empowering him. So the Prophet Muhammad said, I have been informed that you addressed Bilal as the son of a black woman. By the one who revealed the book to Muhammad, none is more virtuous over another except by righteousness. In other words, as the Prophet Muhammad said in another tradition, that God does not look at your outward appearance, nor does he look at your wealth. Rather, he looks at your deeds and your hearts. So your outward appearance, the color of your skin, your ethnicity, your race, it's irrelevant before God. In fact, the Quran says that God made us into different colors, different languages, so we can learn from each other, that he made us from different nations and tribes so we can learn from each other, not so that we would hate each other. And this was one of the key revolutionary messages of the Prophet Muhammad that would solve the problems that are plaguing our society today. The Prophet Muhammad continued. He said, "This means, O Abu Dhar, this statement that you uttered against Bilal, it means that you still have within you some signs of the pre-Islamic days of ignorance. You are a man who has ignorance within your heart, because only somebody with ignorance would make such a horrifically racist statement." And that was enough for Abu Dhar to feel utterly ashamed and humiliated at what he did. And here Prophet Muhammad again is making clear that racism is a sign of ignorance, which Prophet Muhammad came to obliterate, frankly. And there's no room for a civilized, just society to have racism, and that is a result of ignorance. So the Prophet Muhammad basically said that Islam has eradicated all those false standards of measuring and judging people by blood, fame, color, or wealth. That the best of people are those who are best in their conduct, they're best to the creation of God, and that we should never insult or defame each other simply because of race or language or the color of one's skin. So Abu Dhar was so ashamed, so embarrassed at the ignorance he reflected within his heart by acting on a racist statement, that he went straight to Bilal's house and he put his head on the floor there and he said, "This head will not rise from here until the feet of Bilal tread on the face of this foolish, impolite Abu Dhar." He was so embarrassed, he wanted Bilal to step on him as a sign of his remorse for promoting or saying such a racist remark. Bilal responded that this face deserves to be kissed, not trodden upon, and he forgave Abu Dhar. So you see how the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he empowered those who were the victims of racism. He enabled them to overcome that. He enabled them to love, to forgive, and he enabled those who were driven by racism and ignorant to be ashamed of the positions they held and shed their biases, shed their prejudices, and shed their just racist actions. So this is just one small example of the Prophet Muhammad's teachings, again, where he said God does not look at your physical appearance or your wealth, but he looks at your hearts and your deeds. The point here, my brothers and sisters, is he came to transform society. He came to challenge the status quo. He came to fix the problems that were plaguing the world back then, that continue to plague our world and our country today. And I think one of the best accounts that summarizes the message of mercy of the Prophet Muhammad and how he revolutionized, literally he revolutionized human rights and challenged the status quo to empower the weak and the disenfranchised, is the story of the first Muslim refugees. The story of the first Muslim refugees who sought protection of a Christian king. And we're going to talk about the story in detail as it comes up in our weekly class as we study the life of the Prophet Muhammad and his companions. But just to touch upon one small key lesson from it right now, it's a very, very powerful lesson. In fact, what I'll do is I'll try to post a link to a little reenactment you can watch that reenacts this whole experience. It's very powerful. But basically, when the Prophet Muhammad started preaching that there is one God and that all human beings are equal before this one God, and that the rich and powerful cannot abuse the weak and the disenfranchised, cannot abuse women, cannot abuse people because of the color of their skin, really he was challenging the social order, and the wealthy, powerful elites of Mecca obviously were extremely, extremely concerned and upset and angered and outraged, and they thought the best idea is to persecute these Muslims. And literally they were persecuting them, they were torturing them. We're going to talk about how the first martyr of Islam, the first woman who gave her life for Islam, was a woman, Sumayya, who literally was horrifically tortured to death and killed because she would not renounce that there is only one God and that Muhammad was the messenger of God. What drove her to such conviction, to such faith? We'll talk about that in the coming weeks. But anyway, and I think that's a very interesting point, by the way, because people often, they misunderstand Islam and they say wrong perceptions about Islam as it relates to women's rights. And certainly you can see the devotion and the love that women had for the Prophet Muhammad and for the faith, that they were willing to give up their lives, just as the men were, in the face of horrible persecution and torture, because they believed and loved Islam with all of their hearts, and they loved the Prophet Muhammad. May the peace and blessings of God be upon him. So the believers who newly started following the Prophet Muhammad, many of them were women, many of them were former slaves or current slaves, many of them were poor, were needy, they did not have strong tribal support, so they were oppressed and they were tortured. So the Prophet Muhammad told them to escape from Mecca. And we're going to study about this, but again, just a brief glimpse from it now. He told them to escape from Mecca and seek the protection of a Christian king, the Negus, in Abyssinia, which is in Africa. So the Muslims, they fled in the darkness of the night throughout and crossed the desert, crossed the sea, made it to Abyssinia. And the polytheist elite leaders were afraid now. These Muslims now, they found a new safe haven with this king. So let's go to the king's court and say, hey, these people are our runaway slaves. Please send them back to us. So they went to the king's court, and the king was a just king, and he held a trial for these Muslims. So when the king asked the Muslims, he said, tell me, what are you about? The Prophet Muhammad, one of his relatives, Ja'far, said, and this perfectly encapsulates what Islam was about and how Islam really created a social, economic, human rights, civil rights revolution in Arabia at the time, and then eventually throughout the world. He said, "Oh, Your Majesty, here's the Muslims now. They're standing before the Christian king. The polytheist leaders of Mecca are there with tons of gifts." They said camels of gifts to try to to bribe the king into sending these Muslims back to become prisoners and continue their persecution in Mecca. So, and the Muslims are there weak, disempowered, and having to plead their case before this Christian king. So they said, "Oh, Your Majesty, we used to be a people of ignorance. We worshipped idols and ate dead carcasses, committed great sin, severed family relations, and acted according to the law of the jungle, whereby the strong amongst us devoured the weak. We used to believe that survival was only for the fittest. The rich amongst us would devour the poor and the needy. We used to be this way until God sent from amongst us a prophet who was known for his noble descent." And we're going to talk about in the coming classes the descent of the Prophet Muhammad, how he was actually one of the great-great-great-great-grandchildren of the Prophet Abraham through his son Ishmael. So he was known to us for his noble descent and his trustworthiness and his chastity. He invited us to worship God alone and abstain from worshiping stones and idols. He ordered us to speak nothing but the truth and to render back our trusts to those whom they are due. Moreover, he ordered us to keep our good ties of kinship intact and be good to our neighbors, and abstain from what is forbidden and from shedding blood unjustly. He also ordered us not to commit evil, nor to say any false statements, nor to eat up the property of orphans, nor to accuse chaste women of wrongdoing. Hence, we believe in him and in God's message to him. We worship God alone. We rejected that which we used to associate with him as partners, and consequently, we were harassed and abused by our people who tried to turn us away, from what God has sent down to us through the Prophet Muhammad, so that we would return to idol worshipping and the evil way we used to live our life. We were oppressed, abused, and straitened in a way that prevented us from worshiping God. They even tried to force us by threatening our lives and torturing us. Therefore, we fled to your country, and we are seeking asylum to escape oppression from tyranny." 1 second here, I'm going to try to fix something here. And I noticed, so they even tried to force us to turn away. So this is a very interesting message and an interesting point here. And sorry, I think we lost some of the viewers that are on the Celebrate Mercy live stream. Hopefully we have you back now. But anyway, for those who lost us, we are reading the story of Jafar. If you Google, and again, Google normally isn't a good source, but for those who missed the quote, you can, we'll actually copy and paste the quote that I just read. Hanan, if you're watching this, please, if you can actually just copy and paste in the comment section the quote of Jafar when he was pleading his case. One of the interesting points I was going to say about this story, so basically the Muslims made the argument to the Christian king. He said, look, we were oppressing each other, the rich amongst us devoured the poor, the weak, we always fought, we always shed blood, and the Prophet Muhammad came and he invited us to worship one God, but he commanded us to treat each other with justice, with love, and with compassion. Here's a very interesting point, that when it comes, that there are basically God's rights and human rights. What are God's rights? God's rights are that we honor him, we appreciate him, we believe in him. Human rights are that we treat each other with love and with compassion. Now, and mercy. Now, when it came to God's rights, what's greater, God's rights or human rights? What do we think is greater, God's rights or human rights? Often, people are shocked to learn that Islam actually teaches that many times human rights can be greater than God's rights. Why? Because God is based on infinity, right? You can't hurt God. If we all disbelieve in God, it doesn't hurt him. But if we oppress each other, we cheat each other, we hurt each other, that could cause real damage because we're based on finitude. This is why the Prophet Muhammad, they asked him, do you know who the bankrupt person is? They said, yes, the bankrupt person is the one who lost all of his wealth. He said, no, the bankrupt person is the one who worshiped God abundantly, but he cheated this person, he made fun of this person, he gossiped this person. They will take all the worship he did on the Day of Judgment until that person is left with nothing. In other words, you can't simply abuse people and then go into mosque or go into church and pray and think it's all good. You have to actually honor the creation of God. You cannot honor God without honoring the creation of God. The Prophet Muhammad taught that a woman who worshiped God abundantly was sent to be, was deprived of entering paradise because she had a little cat and she abused the cat. She didn't give it food, she didn't give it water until the cat died. By the same token, a prostitute who was traveling in the desert and was thirsty, found a well, climbed in the well and drank, and then when she came out, she saw a thirsty dog. So she climbed back down that well and filled her shoes with water so she could give water to the thirsty dog. Because she gave water to a thirsty dog, because she had mercy on a dog, God forgave all of her sins and entered her into paradise. Islam shows that even having mercy to animals, mercy to a dog can be a means of forgiveness of even great sins. How about mercy to each other, mercy to fellow human beings? So we see that there are God's rights and there are human rights. Here, when it came to God's rights, Prophet Muhammad invited people. He said he invited us to worship God, so that worshiping God is a choice. It is an invitation which we can accept or not accept. If we accept, then we will be blessed. Of course, Islam teaches if we don't accept, then we will have to answer to God for why we didn't believe in him and honor him. But you can't force somebody to believe. So that was by invitation. But when it came to treating each other with justice, with love, with compassion, there's no choice about it. He said he commanded us to speak the truth. He commanded us to treat each other with honor, with love, with compassion. He commanded us to help the poor, the needy. He commanded us not to abuse the orphans, not to slander women. So when it came to human rights, that was by command. There's no choice. You have to honor the creation of God. When it came to believing in God, that was an invitation. People have the right to choose, and then they will be answerable to God accordingly. So that's one lesson, God's rights versus human rights. Secondly is the Prophet Muhammad was challenging the status quo, and that's why his followers were oppressed. That's why his followers were oppressed. That's why he was attacked and persecuted. Because it wasn't simply that he came and told people to worship God in the darkness of their home. No, he said your worship of one God means that you must honor all the creation of God, regardless of race or ethnicity, with justice, with love, with compassion. And that's what scared the wealthy, powerful leaders of Mecca. They feared that if they had to treat the poor and the weak and the disenfranchised with justice, they would lose their ill-gotten wealth, their ill-gotten gains. That's why they persecuted Prophet Muhammad and his followers. And we'll study all this in the coming weeks in our class. Finally, this very important lesson highlights the relationship that the Christians had with Prophet Muhammad, and it was actually one of love and compassion and unity. This Christian king, once he heard the story of the Muslims, and there's more to this story. It's a very beautiful story. Again, I will post a link where you can watch a reenactment of the scene, and also we'll talk about the story as it comes in our weekly classes in more detail. But he actually drew a line in the sand, and he said that the difference between us and you is no thicker than this line. You are welcome to live in my country in peace for as long as you will. So there was great love and compassion between them. And in fact, one of the other projects we'll be working on is putting together a book on Prophet Muhammad and the Christians. There's a lot of wonderful stories which we will go into throughout this series. This is why I really hope you join us every Monday at 6 o'clock. The lectures will be saved online, so you can go ahead and catch up with them online. And also, please be sure to share this live stream so your friends of various faiths and backgrounds can benefit from it. Inshallah. And I hope through this really now, by understanding how Prophet Muhammad came to revolutionize human rights and civil rights, you can understand actually why I personally became a civil rights attorney. I became a civil rights attorney because the Prophet Muhammad taught that the greatest act of worship is to stand up for justice, to stand up for the oppressed, to stand up for human rights and for civil rights. And that's why in Florida, I'm very proud that the American Muslim community, as well as throughout many parts of the country, have built the strongest civil rights organization that serves all people regardless of their race or religion. That is in continuing the message of standing for universal justice that the Prophet Muhammad came to humanity. Again, the Quran says Muhammad was sent as a mercy to all creation, and you cannot be a true Muslim if you're not reflecting that message of mercy to the world around you. My work actually in doing civil rights, it's actually inspired by what is called the Pact of the Virtuous, which the Prophet Muhammad was a part of and which he praised. And this is one of the final stories I want to share with you all today before sharing some quotes and then talking about our next class. But the Pact of the Virtuous, basically in Mecca what happened, and again, as we in the future class we'll talk about Mecca and how it was comprised. It was very much a tribal society where if you were part of a powerful tribe, you were okay. If you were wealthy, you were okay. If you were poor, if you did not have a big tribe to protect you, it was basically the law of the jungle. The rich and the powerful devour the poor and the weak. So a businessman, a leading businessman in Mecca, stole the goods of a foreign businessman who was coming from out of town, and he had no tribe to protect him. So this powerful, wealthy Meccan businessman basically stole the goods of this foreign businessman and wouldn't give him the money that he was due. So this foreign businessman went on door to door saying, "Oh, people of Mecca, please help me. My wealth has been stolen from me. I've been cheated. Help me." And nobody would help him. So finally, this businessman, and again, this was in the time when Mecca was basically predominantly polytheists, and the leaders of Mecca were all polytheists. This was before Prophet Muhammad started preaching the message of Islam. And Prophet Muhammad was still a young man at this time. So this foreign businessman went on top of a mountain in Mecca, and on top of this mountain in Mecca, he started calling that, "Oh people, I've been cheated, I've been oppressed, I've been abused. Where are you? Who will stand for my rights?" So this actually moved some of the noble leaders of the Quraysh in Mecca, the tribe that was really the ruling family in Mecca. And they had this important meeting where they invited various leaders, including the Prophet Muhammad's uncles, and the Prophet Muhammad himself was there. And there they made this revolutionary at the time agreement called Hilf al-Fudul, or the Pact of the Virtuous. And they basically pledged three things. They pledged that no person will be subjected to persecution regardless of whether he or she is native of Mecca or an outsider. 2, that from now on there will be no opportunities for cruelties to occur, and an oppressor's cruelty will not be overlooked, and there will be no further opportunities for oppression to be inflicted, and that we will push for the rights of the downtrodden until they are obtained, that we will stand for those who are wronged, regardless whether they are wealthy or not, regardless of whether they have a family to protect them or not. So this was a covenant that was established by non-Muslims, by people of the polytheists predominantly, to protect the rights of the oppressed. Now, of course, when Prophet Muhammad started preaching his message years later, they forgot about this and started persecuting the Muslims. But nonetheless, it was at the time a beautiful pact that they had pledged to fulfill and to honor. And in fact, many of Prophet Muhammad's even non-Muslims relatives, even when Prophet Muhammad started preaching Islam, stuck by this beautiful pledge. So Prophet Muhammad, years later, when he was leading the Muslim community after preaching Islam, he said, "I was there in Abdullah's home when the oath was affirmed. In my opinion, this oath is more pleasant than owning the finest means of transportation." Back then it was, they would refer to red camels, which is the most expensive. It's like owning a Ferrari in our time. So he said, "This is better to me, basically, than owning a whole parking lot of Ferraris. If I am summoned to it during the Islamic era, I will accept." Here, Prophet Muhammad is saying that even in Islam, if there is an agreement with different religions, different leaders, to protect the rights of the poor, the weak, the needy, the disenfranchised, regardless of their race, regardless of their religion, I would love and I would honor and I would support such a pledge. So again, the Prophet Muhammad came to establish justice amongst the people. And now you probably have, hopefully, a better context for why I will say that the Prophet Muhammad is the most influential and beloved man in the world, but also, unfortunately, the most misunderstood man in the West. And this isn't my word saying. If you look at some of the great scholars, in historians, and what they've written about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he said that in his book, and look it up, Michael Hart's book, The Most Influential Men in History. So he did a ranking of the 100 most influential men in history, Michael Hart, and he chose Prophet Muhammad as the #1 single most influential man in the world, the single most influential man in history. And this is why I'm saying that all of us can benefit from learning about his life, regardless of our race or our religion or ethnicity or where we are from. So he said, my choice of Muhammad to lead the list of the world's most influential persons may surprise some readers and may be questioned by others, but he was the only man in history who was supremely successful on both the religious and the secular levels. It is this unparalleled combination of secular and religious influence which I feel entitles Muhammad to be considered the most influential single man in human history. And this is why all of us, as I mentioned, regardless of our race or our religion or ethnicity, can benefit from studying the life and message of Prophet Muhammad. Understanding his life will have answers to many of the problems we face as individuals, as a country, and the world. I mean, he had a tremendous impact, a tremendously positive impact on our world that none of us can sincerely and genuinely deny, especially through knowledge. And that's what we'll be studying over the coming weeks and coming months as we study his life. And I really believe that by studying his life, we can accomplish two things, as I mentioned earlier. And again, if you're just joining us, please make sure to share this class so other people can benefit. It will accomplish two things. Number one, we believe it will promote unity by dispelling much of the misunderstanding that is out there. And two, that it will benefit society by actually learning from his positive lessons and examples that he said, how he challenged racism, how he challenged oppression, how he challenged injustice, how he stood for human rights of all. You know, as we mentioned earlier, ignorance is destructive to our country. One of my full-time job is challenging Islamophobia. Islamophobia, which is driven by ignorance and misunderstanding, which hopefully we can overcome through this class, makes us less safe and less free. What is Islamophobia? Islamophobia is when we take double standards and take things out of context to promote fear and hate. It makes us less safe and less free as Americans. I remember when I was young, just turned 18 years old, first year in college, I was coming back from a conference in Canada as a young American Muslim, and they were pulling over all the Muslims for secondary inspection as if we were criminals. We were held for 6 hours. We were interrogated, fingerprinted, frisked, just because we attended an Islamic conference. And I told the organizers, I said, look, I told the customs agent, I said, while you're wasting time on us simply because we're exercising our freedom of religion, because we're exercising the Bill of Rights, the U.S. Constitution, which gives us freedom to practice our religion, while you're wasting your time on us, real criminals could be getting by. And they said, we're afraid of the same exact thing. And sure enough, I actually read in the news the next day that a man who killed an entire family in Canada made it across the border with the bloody weapons in his car. But he wasn't stopped for that random inspection, because he looked more like Donald Trump than he did like me. He was basically a white Christian American. The point is, it makes us less safe and less free. Discrimination is not good. It doesn't benefit anyone. It's bad for this country. And discrimination, Islamophobia, it's rooted in ignorance. So hopefully through this dialogue and conversation, we can overcome it. I remember in Tennessee, they tried to pass a law that practicing Islam is treason, punishable by 20 years in jail. That doesn't offend me as a Muslim. It offends me as an American. It offends me as a lawyer. It offends the U.S. Constitution. It's un-American. 70% right now of Trump's supporters 70% of Trump's supporters support the idea of banning Muslims. See how dangerous ignorance is? That doesn't offend Muslims. It offends the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. In Florida alone, we've documented an over 500% increase in anti-Muslim hate crimes and incidents of violence. This is all resulting from ignorance. So by getting to know each other, we can build bridges and overcome this fear and hysteria that is dividing us. And it's also, unfortunately, Islamophobia has been used to not just undermine civil rights, human rights, and peace within our country in America, but it's been used to escalate conflict globally. In Iraq, 500,000 children died in the U.S.-led sanctions. That's before we invaded the second time. And when Madeleine Albright was asked about those 500,000 Iraqi children that were killed, she said, I think the price is worth it. Why? Because the Muslim community, the Muslim faith was dehumanized. So the Muslim children were seen as less than human, and that their lives were worth achieving political and financial goals, like for oil and other economic interests in the region. So we see how Islamophobia has actually led to an increase in conflict, in dehumanizing people, and ultimately led to a decrease in civil rights, and decrease in justice, and decrease in oppression. And many books and studies actually show how Islamophobia is simply a tool that is used by politicians to gain power by promoting fear and hate and turning Americans against each other at the expense of dividing our nation. Georgetown University's Bridge Initiative, and if we can post a link, one of our volunteers can post a link to the Bridge Initiative website. Make sure you follow it. It talks about how Islamophobia is bad for this country. And one of the things it shows is that Islamophobia is not connected to bad things done by somebody who calls themselves Muslim, because there's bad people in every race and religion and group that do bad things. Rather, Islamophobia is really connected to politicians promoting fear and hate against religious minorities in this country to further political goals, especially as it relates to foreign wars and sort of interest that relates to oil and other things, which we don't want to get distracted from our main topic right now. But look up the Georgetown University studies on Islamophobia. So the best way to overcome Islamophobia and thereby promote peace and keep America a free nation, promote peace in the world, is by better understanding Islam. And the best way to understand Islam is by studying the life of the Prophet Muhammad. By studying the life of Prophet Muhammad, we can prevent hate and promote peace in this world. And the best way to learn about Islam and the nearly 2 billion Muslims out there right now is by authentically studying the life of Prophet Muhammad. Unfortunately, the problem that we have is many of us, we learn about other religions, other groups, from the most irrelevant of sources. We learn about it from news, from random Google searches, and that is our tragedy. One of the people, I saw a tweet the other day, said the definition of an Islamophobe is somebody who never met a Muslim and never stepped foot inside a mosque, never studied the life of the Prophet Muhammad, but considers himself an expert on Islam simply from Google. So unfortunately, sometimes having more access to information actually makes us more ignorant, because we don't necessarily get it from the most accurate of sources, and getting knowledge from the wrong sources is one of our tragedies. So let's learn from the right sources. Let's learn from credible sources. Let's learn from the books. Through this course, we will actually have several books that we will be studying from. I'm actually using about a dozen different books and learning from many different scholars to share with you an accurate reflection of the life of the Prophet Muhammad in a way that's very relevant and relatable to all of us here living in America, or living anywhere really in this global world that we live in. In fact, I made sure before teaching this course that I got permission from my teacher, who got permission from his teacher, who got permission from the Prophet, who studied from the Prophet Muhammad in an unbroken chain. And that's amazing that, I know who taught me about the Prophet Muhammad and who taught him, who right from his student in an unbroken chain. So we make sure that the knowledge we're learning about the Prophet Muhammad is actually accurate. Again, because one of the biggest tragedies that we have today is people gaining knowledge from inaccurate sources. So we must be aware of where we are getting our knowledge from. And at the very least, as we wrap up our class today, at the very least, by learning, we can build greater interfaith love and understanding. And beyond that, beyond just dispelling the fear and the misinformation, we can actually benefit from the many beautiful lessons of the Prophet Muhammad that he taught humanity, and that have transformed some of America's greatest leaders, like Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali is known as the greatest American, and he's actually named himself after the Prophet Muhammad after he embraced the faith of Islam, and how the message of Prophet Muhammad, regardless of our religion, can actually solve the problems and the struggles that we face today. Malcolm X, when he actually embraced mainstream Islam after visiting Mecca, he had some very powerful words to say. Malcolm X, of course, was one of the greatest civil rights leaders in our country. He was more extreme in his early days, and yet after going to Mecca and seeing how Mecca brought together different people from all over the world and how all people stood equally before God, and again, we'll talk about this in future classes, but he spoke about how the trip to Mecca transformed him, really revolutionized him, and ultimately, when he again changed his message to a more inclusive message to try to bring America together, regardless of race or religion, that's when he was actually assassinated. Again, people unfortunately are afraid of these kinds of messages that challenge the status quo, that benefit an elite few. So he said, when I was in Mecca making the pilgrimage, I spoke about the brotherhood that existed at all levels amongst the people, all colors who had accepted the religion of Islam. I pointed out what it had done for them, what Islam had done for those people, despite their complexion differences. That it would probably do America well to study the religion of Islam, and perhaps it could drive some of the racism from society. So he's saying Islam, and he was at the heart of the civil rights movement. He said Islam has what it takes to overcome the challenges of racism that we are facing in America, that he faced over 56 years ago, that we continue to face every single day. Malcolm X continued. He said, Muslims look upon themselves as human beings, as part of the human family, and therefore look upon all other segments of the human family as part of that same family. Today, my friends are black, brown, red, yellow, and white. In fact, if you look at the American Muslim community, it is the most racially diverse community. And I believe if we can eliminate, especially racism within the Muslim community, we can be a bridge, a much needed bridge in this country. So he continues, he says, America needs to understand Islam because this is the one religion that erases from its society the race problem. I have never before seen sincere and true brotherhood practiced altogether, irrespective of the color. So he's saying Islam can solve many of the problems, especially the problems related to racism that this country has. So this is why Prophet Muhammad, to wrap up, my friends, my brothers, and my sisters, this is why the Prophet Muhammad is personally a hero of mine, why I'm honored to start doing this weekly course about his life and his message. He tackled the race problem, he empowered women, he ended centuries of conflict, he spread education, he essentially led a revolution in civil and human rights that benefit us to this day, and promoted social and economic justice, and uplifted the poor and the weak, and was not afraid to challenge the status quo and upset the social order if that's what it took to uplift the oppressed and the downtrodden. He's had an impact on the lives of billions, continues to do so today. His name, actually Muhammad, literally means the praiseworthy one, or the one that is most praised, and it is actually the most popular name in the world today. And that in and of itself is a miracle, that he was named the one who will be praised the most, the one who is most praiseworthy, and the most people in the world today have his name. So let's use the next few weeks, let's use the next few months to learn about this. If you've had trouble with the connection, don't worry. We're going to upload and save these classes online so you can review them, and we'll continue the conversation in the next few weeks. Also, what I'll try to do before we wrap up is to answer a few questions that were relevant. We'll definitely review your comments and your feedback. Make sure to share this and send me a message if you'd like a free copy of one of the books of the text that we'll be studying. We will be giving out some free copies in the class. So let me wrap up today's class by summarizing how Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, revolutionized the world, how he had he was the most influential man in the world, had the most positive impact in the world, by studying some of the quotes of what some of the world's greatest leaders said about him. Gandhi, who was well respected for his plight for gaining civil rights in India, he said, I became more than ever convinced that it was not the sword that won a place for Islam in those days in the scheme of life. Rather, it was the rigid simplicity, the utter self-effacement of the Prophet, and the scrupulous regard for his pledges, his intense devotion to his friends and followers, his intrepidity, his fearlessness, his absolute trust in God and his own mission. Those, and not the sword, carried everything before them, and some surmounted every trouble. Lamartine, a famous French philosopher, said about the Prophet Muhammad, if greatness of purpose, smallness of means, and astounding results are the three criteria of human genius, who could dare to compare any great man in modern history with Muhammad? Reverend Bosworth Smith wrote about Prophet Muhammad, saying he was Caesar and Pope in one. Again, as Michael Hart said, he was the one man who was a supremely successful religious and secular leader. He said he was Caesar and Pope in one, but he was the Pope without the Pope's pretensions, Caesar without the legions of Caesar, without a standing army, without a bodyguard, without a palace, without a fixed revenue. If ever any man had the right to say that he ruled by divine right, it was Muhammad, for he had all the power without its instruments and without its supports. Saronji Naidu, a famous Indian poetess, says, Islam was the first religion that preached and practiced democracy. For in the mosque, when the call for prayer is sounded and worshippers are gathered together, the democracy of Islam is embodied 5 times a day, when the peasant and the king kneel side by side and proclaim God alone is great. Finally, we will end with a quote of George Bernard Shaw, who said, I believe if a man like him, like Muhammad, were to assume the dictatorship of the modern world, he would succeed in solving its problems in a way that would bring much needed peace and happiness. I have studied him, the man, and in my opinion, is far from being the Antichrist. He must be called the savior of humanity. I have prophesied that the faith of Muhammad would be acceptable in the Europe of tomorrow as it is acceptable in the Europe of today. So my brothers and sisters, thank you for joining us today. Let's continue this conversation every single week. We'll continue Mondays at 6 unless there's an overwhelming demand for us changing the time. The classes will be saved. Make sure you save it. And let us join together every week to study the life with the intention of gaining an understanding and appreciation and perhaps even learning from his many lessons to find solutions to the many challenges the world faces. Again, by having greater understanding of the life of the Prophet Muhammad, not only can we dispel the misinformation, the stereotypes, and build and dispel the fear and the ignorance that divides us and build more love, compassion, and unity, but we can see why he was the most influential man in history, how he solved the race problem in his society, how he empowered the weak and the disenfranchised, and how we can follow his footsteps to do that today, to promote peace, justice, and unity amongst all of God's creation today. Make sure you follow my page. Follow Celebrate Mercy. We'll see. We might be airing it on Celebrate Mercy moving forward, but we'll keep you posted. Send us feedback about the time. Send us your questions, and make sure please share this. And let's join us every single week Mondays at 6. And also, like I said, we have several books, about a dozen books that we'll be using. Here's just a few of them in this course. We will be giving out some free books. So if you want a book, just share today's class and then send us a message about why you want to learn about the life of the Prophet Muhammad, and we'll be happy to give out some books. I did ask a few friends of mine who are watching this class to send me any questions, and we're just 9 minutes short of an hour, so we'll finish the class by 7, and we will see if we can have any questions. And we're quite a bit, actually. I'm just waiting for some of the questions to come in. If there's any questions, feel free to post it down in the bottom. And that went fast. Time flies when you're having fun, I guess. But thank you. Thank you, all of you, for joining us. Amy is answering, is Muhammad mentioned in the Bible? That will actually be a whole separate talk and conversation, and we're going to talk about it in future classes. But yes, as a practicing Muslim, I do believe Prophet Muhammad was mentioned in the Bible. And that's why in the book I'm compiling about Prophet Muhammad and the Christians, you will actually see so many of the followers of Jesus Christ were awaiting Prophet Muhammad and supported him and loved him because they believed he was the prophet that was foretold in the Bible, in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. So yes, we do believe he was told. In fact, the greetings of Jesus Christ was peace be upon you. That was the greetings of Jesus Christ. And the Bible teaches that the followers of God, the followers of Jesus, the followers of Abraham would greet each other with the greeting, peace be upon you. And that is actually how Muslims greet each other. They say, Assalamu alaikum, which means peace be upon you. And we'll talk about this more in class. Like I said, I plan to have this as quite a long-running course. We're going to talk about the history of Arabia, the history of Mecca, the Prophet Muhammad's lineage, his birth, his childhood, the persecution the Muslims faced, how they established finally a city-state, what happened at Prophet Muhammad's death and afterwards. And hopefully, by getting a better understanding of the Prophet Muhammad's life, we can build a more tolerant, just, inclusive society. And let's learn together, why was he the most influential man in history? How did he have such a tremendous impact? And how can we have some of those positive impacts today to overcome the problems that are plaguing society today, that are dividing us, and that are building, unfortunately, acts of violence, injustice, oppression, and division. So thank you, everybody. It's been a pleasure. Forgive my shortcomings. I know I speak too fast, but we'll look forward to continuing the class together. Thank you. and God bless you. Peace be upon you. Please share this class, send us your feedback, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. Peace be with you. Wassalamu alaikum, and God bless.